Joseph's in jail. Remember what happened last week? He was sold into slavery, his freedom was taken, and now he's been framed. He's been thrown in prison. This guy who stood up for God, who stood up for what was right, decided to live for God even when things are really hard and he could have just wallowed in self-pity. Well, he's been thrown in prison. Mrs. Potiphar told her husband a lie. He burned with anger and threw Joseph in a dungeon. That's really hard, isn't it? What must Joseph have been thinking? It seems so unfair. Lockdown again? How long for this time, God? Will I ever see the light of day again? What must Joseph have been thinking? It does seem unfair, but there are a couple of things that we can take from this story that will really help us and are really good news. First thing, the Bible says that throughout everything in this story, the Lord was with Joseph. What do you think Joseph must have been thinking in that moment? He had worked his way up. He had achieved some level of freedom and security again in Potiphar's house. He had chosen to honour God, and suddenly he's forced into lockdown again. What would Joseph have been thinking? Maybe he would have been afraid. Who's going to be in jail? He's afraid of others there with him in this dungeon. Or maybe he was afraid that he would never see the light of day again. We don't know. He might have been. Maybe he was afraid that he would be killed. He knew that Potiphar was a man you didn't want to trifle with, and he was burning with anger. Not someone you wanted to see burn with anger. It was all completely out of his hands. I'm sure he would have been terrified. He was in prison in desperate circumstances. Can you imagine what an Egyptian prison must have been like? There was definitely unlikely any sunlight, no bed, no hope. That fear could have left him completely unable to do anything, and could have left him doubting God. But this is Joseph. Despite that fear that he must have been facing, the Bible shows us that he didn't let the fear overcome him. He knew something. He knew a truth about God, something that he had to cling on to. Throughout all this section of Genesis, there's a phrase in Joseph's story that's repeated over and over. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him. And Joseph, he kept going despite the fear and the frustration. He had patience, he kept going because he knew what God was like. It's that trust in God despite the circumstances. He knew that hardship didn't mean that God was far away from him. These hard circumstances, he knew that they didn't mean that God had forgotten about him. God was with Joseph and continued to show him kindness, and actually continued to protect him and deliver him in jail. And you know what happens next in the story? The baker and the butler, both Pharaoh's servants, who had been thrown into prison as well, they come to Joseph. They heard he was a dreamy guy. We both have had dreams, they said, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph answered them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And Joseph, by God's power, he told them what their dreams meant. The baker was going to be executed, but the butler, he was going to be reinstated, put back in his job, in his original position beside Pharaoh, back in Pharaoh's good books. Once again, he would be tasting the wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned for Pharaoh. So it's all going to happen, and Joseph says to the butler, "When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." And it all happens that the butler is reinstated and the baker is executed. But the butler didn't remember Joseph. In fact, the butler forgot about him. 2 more years went by in this prison. Joseph wondering, Maybe today. Maybe the butler's told Pharaoh today. But 2 years, it's a long time. And gradually, I'm sure he would have felt more and more let down, more and more hurt, confused, angry. It is hard, isn't it? When you don't know what's going to come next, when you don't know when freedom's going to come. And yet to still live for God and to trust that God is close and will keep his promises throughout all that confusion and frustration, it is hard. Joseph was let down in his lockdown, but we won't be in our lockdown. That's good news. Joseph was let down by a forgetful butler, but we won't be forgotten by our remembering God. Think about this. Jesus on the cross, with two others on crosses either side of him, two thieves. And all three of them, they're being executed. But one of the others, he rejects Jesus, but the other, he says this to Jesus. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You can read about it in Luke chapter 23. Don't forget me, he says. And Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus said that, and it's a promise that's rock solid. That's the second thing we can take away from this part of Joseph's story. The butler forgot Joseph, but God, Jesus, has not forgotten us. It's something we can cling on to any time, because lockdown, social distancing, or freedom, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change it. We are not forgotten. God remembers us today because we have been saved in Jesus. We are free in him today. So why not have a think? Why not try and put it in your own words? You can chat about it with family, or you can just think in your head. What does it mean that God has remembered us? Have a think about that today. It even ties in some of those themes in Zechariah. We saw God remembers his people. But for now, we can remember that Jesus, who suffered, who died for us, he hasn't forgotten us.